All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Automation Hour. Thanks for joining us. If you're joining us for the first time, all lines will be muted. Please post your questions either to in the webinar itself, or you can post it out on our Trailblazer community, Salesforce Automation Hour. We'll be looking there as well. And sometime after the webinar, we will post the recording out on our website, automationhour.com, also on our Trailblazer community, Salesforce Automation Hour, and we will tweet it out and post it out on LinkedIn as well. And if you haven't signed up for our sessions through June, definitely highly encourage you to do so. We have some great repeat presenters and VPs, some first-time presenters. So even if you can't join us in person, register anyways, and you'll get the link to the recording after the fact. And shortly, we will be soliciting for presenters for the latter half of this year. So if you have a cool process automation business use case and a solution that you would like to share, definitely reach out to us and we'll get you on. And we can't have this free webinar series without our sponsor, Concrete.io, who's been with us since the very beginning. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And here are your co-hosts, David, myself, and Rakesh. This seems ages ago where we were at Midwest Dreamin' and in 2019. So hopefully after we get all vaccinated and things get back to semi-normal, we'll be able to gather again and see you all in person. And I'm very excited to have our guest presenter on, Sarah. She is, I've attended so many of her sessions at community events and whatnot. I always learn a little bit something new from her. So very excited to have her on presenting for the first time. I can't imagine why we haven't had her on before, but here she is, and we're just really excited to have her. And let me hand over presenter rights to Sarah. And you should have control.
All right. Make sure I'm showing the right screen here. Can you see the presentation?
I could see slide 6, and it looks like you're in like a presenter mode with speaker notes.
There we go. That should be the right monitor then.
Yes, that looks good.
Okay, great. I'll just say hi to everybody. My webcam here. Great. I am so honored and pleased to be here. I'm really excited to talk to you all today about one of the favorite things I've ever built using Flow. So, 3 things I want to cover today are I'm going to show you 3 different flows. One that's going to allow us to open any record when you just have the ID for that record. One that's going to allow you to open up a flow from outside of setup. You don't have to go to the setup menu to open it. And finally, how to check the lock status of a record using only the ID. And before we get diving into these flows to see how I've built them, what makes them unique is that they're all going to be launched from the utility bar. And if this is a feature you haven't explored much yet, you can find that on the bottom of every Lightning page. So it's that little white strip that has icons for various utilities. And regardless of whether you're looking at an account or a contact, it's going to persist. And that means that things that you put on the utility bar, you can access from anywhere in Salesforce. To open a utility, you just click on it and it's going to pop up a little window. And for the examples that we'll be looking at today, that's where your flow is going to run. It's going to run in that little pop-up. Unfortunately, the utility bar is only available on desktop. So if you do a lot of mobile work, this isn't necessarily going to help you out. But as admins, we are often working on the desktop. And so that's where I like to store these tools. You can edit the utility bar in App Manager. So utility bars are unique to the app that you're working in. So you can have different utilities in different apps. One thing you might want to do is make an admin app just for yourself and put your admin utilities on that utility bar. And there's a lot of different utilities to choose from, but obviously what we're going to be focusing on today is flow. If you want, there's more, you can search for more utilities on the App Exchange, and you can even build your own custom components to launch from there. But let's get to why we're here, which is automation. And I'm going to start with a few considerations for running flows from the utility bar. You'll notice in here in the properties, there's no place to enter a record ID. So for the flows that we're going to be running today, the first step we're going to do is enter that record ID. If you want to have a flow that knows what record you're launching, if you're using a flow that requires that record ID be passed into the flow, the alternatives are you can put the flow as a record page component, or you can use a quick action. But if you're launching from the utility bar, you have to feed it the record ID. It's not going to know what record you want to look at until you tell it. So let's get right to the first flow, which is opening a record using that ID. How many times have you received an email that something happened in a flow and you get an error email and you get this ID, right? And you're like, oh, I really want to go look at that record to see what might have caused this error. Well, you can copy the ID, and if you go searching for it in Salesforce, it's not going to work because you can't search by ID number. So, okay, fine. You can go ahead and type it into the URL. You can add it to your URL directly, and it's going to go ahead and open up that record. But typing all of that extra information is a pain. It takes a while. So wouldn't it be cool if we could just copy and paste that record ID into a flow, and then it'll open up the record for us? Pretty cool. So in order to do that, we're going to need a couple of flow components from Unofficial SF, which if this is new to you, Unofficial SF is a great resource for learning about all things flow. And they have a bunch of components and actions that we can add to our flow to help us get more stuff done. The two actions we're going to use are navigate to record and open URL. And we're also going to use a screen component called navigation button. This is strictly speaking not required to run these flows, but I think it makes it look a little nicer and cleans up the user interface a little bit. The other thing we need to know before we get started is how Salesforce URLs work, because we're going to rely on those to open up these records. So here's a record URL from a contact record, or no, an account record. And the first part represents the my domain, or the domain name for your organization. And this is going to be different for every org, but it's going to be persistent across all URLs in the same org. The next part of the URL is specifying that we're looking at it in the Lightning app, and it's saying what object we're looking at, in this case, an account. And then there's that record ID. And finally, a parameter to say whether we want to open it in view or edit mode. Some items, like if you're looking at a user record, for example, open up in the setup menu. So we need to look at that URL as well. You'll notice the first part is the same. It's that my domain. Then the second part tells us that we're in setup and that we're looking at users, the record ID again, and then some additional URL parameters that tell Salesforce how to open up that record. So we're going to use these two different URLs, and we're going to take the flow that we enter the record ID, plug it into the URL, and then open up the record. One of the things, actually going back one, how are we going to know the difference between which URL to use? That's relying on the record ID. So in Salesforce, record IDs have a 3-character prefix. So the first 3 characters of every Salesforce ID are going to tell you what type of object it is. In the case of an account, that's going to be 001. If you're looking at a contact, it's 003. And for a user, it's 005. So we're going to use that 005 prefix in order to know that we need to use the setup URL instead of the Lightning app URL. So this is the basic outline of the flow. You'll see it's pretty simple, just really three main pieces. The first is the input. Then we make a decision based on that prefix, whether we're going to open up a record, or if that record's a user, open up the user, and then we have an error message. But let's actually dive into Flow Builder and take a look at that flow in particular. So how do we have this first screen set up? Oh, I think I've been logged out. Hang on one second. Just got to log back in. Sorry about that. Should have checked before I started that I wasn't logged out. Now you'll notice that I'm going to open this flow using the setup menu, and one of the things we'll talk about in a minute is this is kind of a lengthy process, and it takes a little bit of time to find the flow you want to open up. So we're going to touch on that in a minute to show you how you can do that better. But for right now, let's go back to our open record flow. Here we are, and we'll take a look at that first screen. So what we're doing here is we're going to have a text element, and all this is doing is collecting that record ID from the user, and then we're going to use a navigation button to say open record. And if this is a component that you might not have seen before, there's three pieces you really need to pay attention to. One is the button label, so that's what the button is going to display. And then the navigation type is saying, what do you want this button to do? In this case, we just want it to take the next action. So this is saying it's the equivalent as if we were just using the native flow next action. And to take a look at that, if we're looking at the screen properties, so now I'm looking at the properties of this whole screen element. If I click show footer, you'll see this is the standard navigation, and you can control which buttons are displayed here. But I'd rather have a button that says, instead of saying next or finish, I want it to say open record. So I'm going to use this special button. And you can hide that footer so that you can't even see that button. We could also hide the header so we don't see the name of the flow when we open it up. And then in my navigation button, it's going to say open record, and we're going to say navigation type is next, and then the target type is standard. That just says use the standard flow navigation. So once we've put in that record ID, we're going to have to decide what type of record, what type of object that record is. And to do that, I've created a formula. And if that formula is going to tell me what the first three digits of the record ID are, and if it equals 005, then I know we're looking at the user object. Let's take a look at the formula real quick. So we'll go over here to our resource manager and open up the formula. And you can see all it does is it's using the text formula left, looking at that record ID, and this variable here is the input variable from that text box on the first screen. And it says, give me the leftmost three characters. So that's the first three characters going from left to right. So once we've determined what type of object it is, we're going to go and use one of these actions, depending on which object it is. So let's look at the user object first. This action is the open URL action. And what it does is you input a URL and then it opens it. That's all it is. But again, for this URL, I've created a formula to tell it what URL to use. Let's look at that formula. Now this formula, you'll notice, looks a little bit familiar from the slide we were looking at before. Here's the my domain part, followed by the lightning setup menu part that tells it we're in the setup menu all the way until we get to this record ID. And this is that same record ID variable from the input text box that we had before. And then the following URL parameters. And when I was building this the first time, I had to experiment a little bit with how to build this URL to make sure I was opening it correctly. But if you just go to the object that you want to open, you can look in the URL on your browser and figure out the parameters you need in order to open it. Now, one thing to note is I've hard-coded this URL right here, which is not best practice. What you could do, since this part right here is not going to change for anywhere in my org, is I could use a custom label or custom metadata type to store this information and then reference it in my flow using the custom label. I haven't done that for this demo, but that's what I would recommend if I was going to build this again. So that formula sets up the URL that will then be opened by this action. Now, if we're not looking at a user, if we're looking at any other object, there's another action called navigate to record. And this record action has it built into it that all you need to do is give it a record ID and it will open that record. So it's a little bit simpler. We don't need to construct the URL. We can just use the record ID from that same text box input variable. And then in case anything goes wrong, I like to show an error screen just to give the user some feedback that something happened rather than getting an unhandled fault, which is confusing. All right, so let's take a look at this in action. And to do that, you'll notice down here on my utility bar, I haven't yet added that flow to the utility bar. So let's go ahead and do that in App Manager, just to show you how easy this is. I have an extra space in there. I'm going to go open up App Manager and go to my app that we're looking at. This is just a demo app that I have set up for my little fake Otter Cakes Bakery. And we're going to go to Utility Items. You'll notice it's desktop only. And I'm going to add a utility item. And we're going to add a flow. And in the properties, I'm going to want to specify the label for my flow. In this case, it's open record. And that's what's going to display on the utility bar. I want to choose an icon that is meaningful. In this case, let's use this little open icon. And then you can set the width and the height of the panel. So that's the little pop-up window. We'll just leave it for this for now, but you can play around with that to customize it to fit your flow perfectly. And then I'm going to select which flow I want to run. And in this case, it's the utility open record flow. If you wanted to edit your flow, you can jump to Flow Builder from here, but we already set it up, so it's good to go. I'm just going to save that. Now, if we go to our home page and refresh, you'll see this open record flow is now listed in the utility bar, and it pops up this the flow that we just built. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab a record ID just to show you how this works. I'm going to grab it from the URL. You could say you got this ID from an email, really anywhere. If we go back to our home screen, I'm going to pop that record ID into the text box, going to click open record, and it's going to take me back to that record. So, and I can do that from anywhere. So let's say I'm looking at an account for some reason, and I'm like, oh, I want to open a record. Doesn't matter where you are in Salesforce. If you put that record ID, it's going to open that record for you. I use this all the time as an admin when I just have a record ID and I want to quickly hop to that record. So that's flow number 1. Let's look at flow number 2, which is similar, but I decided when I was doing this, I was like, oh, if I can open a record, I wonder if I can open a flow. And as we saw before, when I had to go through that whole reopening my org, it can take a long time to get from the home page, starting in a Lightning app, to open setup, to find your flows by typing in the quick find box, getting to your flow list view, and then you have to decide if you click on the flow label, it's going to open up the most recent active version. But if you have an inactive version that you're working on, you might have to click over here on the drop-down menu, choose View Details and Versions, then finally click Open. And now we're in Flow Builder, but it took 5 different pages and 7 clicks, which is a lot of effort. So instead, what if you could just, from a drop-down menu, choose a flow that you wanted to open, decide whether you wanted to open it in the Flow Builder or Detail page, click Open, and away you go. Now, like we had to do before and understand how Salesforce IDs and URLs are built, we have to understand for this flow how flow IDs work. In Flow, or in Salesforce, flows are defined by 2 different IDs. There's a durable ID and the latest version ID. And the difference between these, we need to know the difference so that we can open up either in Flow Builder, one is for Flow Builder and one is for that details page that I showed you. So the details and versions page that allows you to choose which version you want to be opening. Again, we have our my domain for that URL. Then the piece of the URL that tells you to go to setup, and this time we're looking at flows, not users. This uses the durable ID of your flow, and then those additional URL parameters. Conversely, if you want to open up in Flow Builder, you have the same my domain. This time there's a piece that says open up Flow Builder. And then the record ID that you're going to want is the latest version ID. And this, again, took me some guessing and checking to figure out when I was building these flows. So here's the open record. This should be the open flow. And it's very similar to the one we saw before with this added step of figuring out which ID we want to use. But the basic principle applies that we're going to select a flow on the screen and then decide whether you're opening the flow builder or detail page, similar to whether it was a user or a different record. Go to the appropriate action. In this case, these are both the open URL action and then your error message screen. So let's hop over here. Go back to my list of flows. And we're going to go to open flow. All right, so here we are. Let's take a look at this first screen. Very similar to the screen before, but in this case, instead of having a text inbox or text input box that we did for the record ID, I wanted to be able to allow folks to, users to choose their flow from a dropdown. And so to do that, we had to create a set of choices based on the flows that exist in the system. Let's go look at those choices. So I created a choice record set, because flows are stored as records in Salesforce. So similar to if you want to look up a record choice set for accounts or contacts, you can do the same thing for flows. The object that you're looking at is the flow definition. That's Salesforce's way of saying this is the flow object and we're going to get records for the flow object. You don't necessarily need to set conditions, but and a lot of times if you have flows that are installed as part of managed packages, you don't really have access to editing those, so you probably don't want to see them in this list. So I filtered it out by using the manageable state field. And if that equals unmanaged, I know that those are flows that I've probably written myself. So those are the flows that I'm going to want to be opening. I have it sorted to ascending by last modified date, just so the newest ones are near the top. And then for each choice, the way a record choice set works is it's going to get a set of records and create a choice for each one. And for each choice, you need to say, what do you want to have as the label in the drop-down list? In this case, we're using the flow label, i.e. the name of the flow. And then what is stored when you select that choice? In this case, we're going to store the durable ID. But we also want to store those other IDs that we talked about before, including the latest version ID. So I created a separate text variable to store that ID. So when you make a choice from the drop-down menu, the durable ID will be stored as the choice value, and the latest version ID will be stored in this variable, selected flow latest version ID. This ID I stored originally, when I originally created this, I wasn't sure which ID I needed, so I stored both, but it turns out the latest version ID is the one you want. So then I have an assignment variable here, and basically what it does here is I'm taking the selection from the pick list and storing it in another text variable. And I think strictly speaking, this is probably an unnecessary step, but it makes it a little bit easier for sorting out what's happening in the flow. So I'm just assigning to this text variable the selection from the pick list. And if you remember, that's going to be the durable ID. And then we're going to look at the decision. Oh, let's go back to the screen for a minute first. That decision depends on the screen, the second part of the screen, which is another set of choices, and that's whether you want to open up your flow in Flow Builder or in the detail page. And those are just simple choices. For when you create radio buttons, you can create choices that aren't a record set or just a single choice. And just to take a look at what that is, just look at one of them. All you do is say, what do you want the label for that choice to be? In this case, we want it to say Flow Builder. And what are you going to store? When you select that choice, we're storing it as text, and it's going to be the same. The value is going to be Flow Builder. So depending on which choice they select, we can take the value that's output from that and decide which the open action is the name of the radio choice buttons. And if it equals the Flow Builder choice, so if it equals Flow Builder, then we're going to go to the Flow Builder URL. And if it equals the detail page choice, we're going to go to the detail page. And in each case, these are both, again, that open URL action. And again, I've built the URL using a formula. So let's look at those really quickly. So the detail page formula, again, has your my domain, then it says go to setup and flows, and then here's that durable ID. Remember, we stored that variable using that assignment from the record choice set, stored the durable ID, put it in here in the formula, and then the rest of the URL parameters. If we're opening up Flow Builder, we're going to use that latest version ID that we stored when we selected the record choice. And so this action will open up using the Flow Builder URL. And if they've decided they want to open it in the detail page, it'll open it up using the detail page URL. And again, a simple error screen in case something goes wrong. We don't want to leave them hanging. All right, so let's take a look at that in our utility bar. I've already added it down here, so I'm going to just click Open Flow. And I'm going to get ready for our next set, which is the record lock status. So I'm going to click Record Lock Status, choose Flow Builder. And when I click Next, it's going to open it up in Flow Builder for me. If instead I wanted to go to the detail page, I could select the flow that I want, click Detail Page, and then it would open up that page. So here we are in Flow Builder. Here's a little preview of what's to come. Just to show you that it does open up the detail page. Here we are. Being slow on the detail page, but there it is. And in this case, if I clicked from the list view of the flows, it would open up version 5, but perhaps I wanted to open up version 6, so I could just open up that one from here. All right. Let's move on to the third utility flow. And this one is a more recent one I've created because I found myself, I would get complaints from users that they couldn't edit a record and I wasn't sure if that record was locked or not. It sounded like that might be what was going on, but I wanted an easy way to check the status of a record. Without this flow, I would normally either go to the developer console or perhaps check approval history, or you could even create a special checkbox field on the record that determined if it was locked or not. But none of these are particularly convenient. So I thought surely there must be a better way to do it. And what better way but flow? So again, you're going to need a few extra Apex actions in order to make this work. One from unofficial SF, which is unlock records for approval processes. And then from the app exchange, I use this lock record Apex action. And strictly speaking, you don't need this part to check the status. You can use that using the unofficial SF components, but I wanted to make this so that you could check the status and then change the status, in which case we need the lock record Apex action. All right, so here is our lock record status flow, and it's a little bit more complex than the other ones. So let's just dive right into Flow Builder and check it out. The first screen is very similar to our open record screen, where we're going to input the record ID, and then we're going to have a navigation button that says check lock status. And again, this is just a navigation button that's functioning as the next button, but gives a little bit more flexibility into what that button says. Strictly speaking, not needed, but I like to add it. So then we're going to use that. This is from the unofficial SF unlock records, and there's an action called get record lock status. And what this Apex does is it takes the record input from that text box, record ID input, and it's going to check the lock status, and then it'll return either a true or a false. And so I've stored the result of the Apex in a variable created that I called lock status result. And this is going to be a Boolean, so either a true or a false, depending on whether the record is locked or not. I'm then going to display that result on a screen here. And I could have just said the record you checked is locked and then displayed the value of it. But I wanted to add some functionality using a toggle that's going to let us let us change the status. So in this case, let's do some setup here. The active label, so when it's true, it's sorry, I think my headset went to sleep on me. Can you still hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thanks. I heard a little beep. So, all right, so the active label is going to be locked. The inactive label is going to be unlocked. And we're going to set the default value equal to that variable that came from our Apex action, the lock status result. So what that means is this toggle, when we see it, is going to have the value based on the result of our check lock status action. And then I give some instructions. If you want to change the status, just switch the toggle. And then this navigation button says change lock status. And it'll go on to next. And if you don't want to change the status, you can just click next and it'll finish the flow and start over again. So this decision here is going to say, did the lock status change, or was that button clicked? So going back to our navigation button for a second here. One of the more advanced pieces of using the navigation button is you can store the output of whether the button was clicked or not. And in this case, we're going to say, was button 1 clicked? We're going to store that in a variable. So I'm going to create a new variable, and I'm going to call it change status button. Give it a little description. And then we're going to store this as a Boolean as well. And it's either going to be true or false, depending on whether they clicked that button or not. So if the button is clicked, this variable will be true. If it wasn't clicked, that variable will be false. I'm going to click done there. And then in my decision, I can add that variable in here. So if the change status button equals true, then the change lock status was checked. Otherwise, end the flow. So in this case, we're going to change the lock status. Great, it was clicked. And rather than just letting anybody do this, I wanted to check if this person was an admin or not, because otherwise they're going to get an error. So I pull the admin profile. In this case, I'm looking for a profile where the name is equal to system administrator. Decide if the user profile ID, so the running user, if their profile ID equals, and here is one additional piece of interest is that when this record gets pulled, the ID that gets stored is the 18-character ID, whereas this ID, the user profile ID here, is going to be a 15-character ID, so we have to convert one to the other. So we're going to do a little formula to do that. And this is going to be very similar to the other formula that we used to get the character prefix from the record ID. We're going to call this profile 15-digit. Convert the 18-character profile ID to 15. It's going to be a data type is text, and then we're going to use that same formula, the left formula, and this time we're wanting to get the ID from that record that we looked up. So we're going to go to the profile record variable. We're going to use profile ID, and I'm just going to want the first 15 characters. So that's converting this 18-character ID to a 15-character ID. And now in our decision, we can say, does the 15-character user profile ID match the formula profile 15-digit ID? And if it does, it's going to go ahead and lock or unlock. And if it doesn't, then they get a screen saying, sorry, you can't do this. Now, finally, the decision we need to make is, are they trying to lock the record or are they trying to unlock the record? Because there's different different actions for each one of those. So we're going to check on those. In the case of they have switched it to lock, so now the toggle says lock, we're going to go ahead and lock that record using the record ID from before that they inputted. If the toggle is equal to false and they want to unlock the record, we're going to unlock the record. Same idea. These are those extra Apex actions that we installed. And then once they've done that and the lock status is successfully updated, we're going to give them a little message. And let's actually add in here, I'm going to see if I can add in, I think we'd have to check the lock status again to tell them what the new status is. So we're just going to leave it that it was successful. If for some reason it doesn't work, again, we're going to give them an error screen. Sorry, something went wrong. All right, so let's save this. We're going to activate it. And then we're going to go check, see how it works. So in this case, I'm going to copy this record ID from this opportunity. I'm going to click on record lock status in the utility bar that I've already added there, paste this in, and now it's going to show me the lock status for this record. It looks like it's currently locked. I want to unlock it. I'm just going to click that toggle. I'm going to say change lock status. Great. And now if we check it again, we'll see that it's now unlocked. And if I wanted to just check another record ID, I would just click next. So that is pretty much what I have to share with you today. 3 pretty simple flows, all of which you can put in the utility bar and hopefully make your little admin lives a little bit easier. So if there are any questions, I'd be glad to take them.
Awesome. All right. First question is from Alan. Sarah mentioned utility items are available on the App Exchange. I don't see a separate listing for them like there are for apps or components. How do I find those utility items?
That's a good question. I think generally some components are available in like as screen components and utility components. So it should list that in the App Exchange listing for the component, but I am not entirely sure if it does. I'd have to double check on that.
Okay.
But I can get back to you in the Automation Hour Trailblazer community. I'll post a follow-up for that.
All right, great. Next question, is it possible to have a similar flow to open process builders?
Ooh, that's a great question. I have not thought about that, but I bet you can. What I would do is I would go to Setup, go to Process Builder, and if we open up a Process Builder, and I'm not entirely sure this will work, but since looking up here, there doesn't seem to be a unique record for this Process Builder. What you could do is definitely open up this URL, but I'm not sure how you would get to a specific process builder without a record ID. I'd have to do some more research on that. These flows all rely on being able to get to a very specific place in Salesforce using the URL. So process builder kind of obfuscates that a little bit. Now, the secret is that process builders under the hood are actually flows, so they probably have their own flow definition. I just don't know if you could get it open in this format, in this builder.
Mm-hmm. All right. Next question. First, many thanks for the fantabulous presentation, Sarah. Question, any tips regarding naming conventions in Flow Builder, e.g. variable names, API names for resource types, etc. As the number of flows in an org grows, so many names, LOL. Thanks again.
Yeah, I run into this all the time. I'd starting with like the label of the flow. I like to put a little bit about what the flow is used for. In this case, this is a utility flow. In my production org, I have different departments have different flows, so I'll put the department name before the flow. As for naming conventions, there's a bunch of different ones. I think my suggestion would be to pick something that works for you and stick with it. In my case, I don't always do that, honestly, if I'm being honest, but I like camel case, which is capitals and then lower cases. Sometimes, for example, when we were looking at that button variable, I added the word button at the end so that I knew that this was from a button. I'm sure actually Jen would probably be able to speak on this topic at some point, but I don't always follow my own suggestions. I'll just put it out there like that. But some people like to, when they're creating a variable, if it's a text variable, you would put a T at the beginning. If it's a Boolean, a lowercase b. I've seen that a lot. For formulas, you could put an F at the beginning. It all really comes down to being able to find the variable or the resource later in the flow when you're like in an element and you want to add it, like when we wanted to add that variable here, I just want to be able to find it really quickly, and differentiate between perhaps similarly named things. I will say that the most helpful thing is, regardless of what you name something, is filling out those description fields so that when you go back, you're like, why was I using this? Okay. So definitely always put in a little description to tell you what that resource or variable is for.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally agree. So for us, when I create variables, I'll usually put var for a single variable. If it's a collection, I'll put collection in somewhere in the name, formula, text template. Again, just so as I'm trying to find them, as I'm doing the configuration, I could easily type collection and I'll find all the collection ones, for example.
Yeah, it's really about what works for you and
Mm-hmm.
making it easiest for you.
Mm-hmm. Great. Jennifer Lang says, this is great. Thanks, Jen and Sarah. Another question, what does it mean when a record is locked?
Oh, generally speaking, it's if you have an approval process, and it mostly pertains to opportunities in my experience, though I think other records, well, there's kind of two different kinds of locking. There's locking when somebody's working on a record. You might very occasionally run into this issue that if you're trying to do a simultaneous save as somebody else in your org, then you'll see, oh, this record was locked. And this comes up more often when you're doing mass imports, for example. Data imports, you might see that a row was locked and couldn't be accessed. And that has to do with the databases working on that record, so you can't work on it while somebody else is working on it. There's another type of locking of records which happens in approval processes when you have an opportunity and you submit it. It's complete, it's one, or perhaps it's lost, but more often it's a one opportunity, and it's been submitted for approval. So it's good to go. It's locked, or it's all done, and you want to approve it, either by an accounting manager or someone in your sales department. That approver will then say either, yes, this is an approved opportunity, no, it's not. And it's going to, once they have like signed off on it, then the record gets locked so that future changes are prevented. And basically it's a way of saying, okay, this opportunity is approved as is. We don't want to make changes on it later. So you lock that record. That was a long-winded explanation, but I think it gets the point across. And once it has been locked, I believe system administrators can usually edit it if need be, but non-sysadmin profiles can't. And that comes up sometimes, that folks will be like, oh, we really do need to edit this, and I get approval from, like, the data entry person put it in, the approval, the accounting manager signed off on it, but then later on does need to make an adjustment. And so comes to me and asks about it. Instead of me necessarily making the adjustment, I can unlock it temporarily for them to make the adjustment and then relock it after it's done.
Just a reminder for folks, if you have a question about Sarah's presentation or a general process automation question, you can post that here or the Trailblazer community. Let me see if there's anything there. Next question is, could you discuss your methodology regarding pre-work before actually creating a new flow in Flow Builder? Also, do you build your flow sequentially, or do you build out your resources up front? Thanks again.
Yeah. Pre-work. Depending on what I'm doing, if I'm creating a totally new process that we don't have anything like it in our system yet, I will sit down and sort of whiteboard it on a piece of paper, or even write out an outline like in a Word document where I say, okay, what object is this acting on? When does it want to happen? Like, is it, you have to start with, does it require user interaction? Okay, it's going to be a screen flow. Is it going to be an automation that happens when something else happens in Salesforce? Either then you're maybe talking about an auto-launched flow or a record-triggered flow. So the first step is to figure out what is the trigger for this flow happening? Where does it start? And then I sort of do step through. I think it's helpful to think about what is the process as it currently exists, because a lot of times there is already, your users are doing something to make this happen, whether that's clicking on the contact and then going to the opportunity and then filling out a field and then going back to the contact. Like, understanding what the workflow is really helps figure out like how to translate that to automation. So I do interviews with my users to talk about what they're doing in their jobs and what are especially the repetitive tasks that they could be replacing with flow. And then I think about, okay, for each step of the process as they're doing it, how would that translate to flow? Is that a decision point? Is that a looking up a record? Is that updating a record? And then start mapping it out in my head how I'm going to do it. Once I have a general picture, I will just hop into Flow Builder and start building. I tend to build sequentially. So building my variables when I need them, rather than thinking out all the variables I might need and creating them. You can create them just from this resource button. You can create any variable, constant, any of that stuff you need all up front, but I tend to build it as I'm going through my flow. So I get to this screen and I say, in this case, it's just the text input is going to be the variable. But if I wanted to put a default value in here, I would just go from here and then create a new resource directly from my screen that I'm working on. That's how I tend to do it. But with Salesforce, and there's so many ways to do things, and there often isn't a right way. Again, it's the way that works for you. And I definitely iterate my flows. Always, I start, I build in a sandbox or a developer org. And so I can sometimes have, 10 to 15 versions of a flow before I'm ready to move it over into production, because I'll try it out. Oh, no, that didn't quite do what I wanted to. Change this around, go back. Debug is also my friend. I do debug a lot. So some kinds of flows, record-triggered flows in particular, are hard to debug at the moment using the debug tool here. But if you're unfamiliar with this is a great tool where you can run the flow in a test way, where it's going to show you what the flow is going to look like, but it also gives you the details of what's going on with your flow as it happens. So that can be a really helpful way if a flow isn't working quite the way I thought it was when I built it the first time. I can use the debugger to figure out how to fix it.
Mm-hmm. I would say if you're starting out with Flow for the first time, I would definitely write it out and think through it before building it, because it's easier to change things on paper than after you configured it and then now you're deleting things and moving things around and whatnot.
Yeah. And I will say there are some things that have gotten a lot easier. You'll notice when we're doing these get records, this is Salesforce now will like store the fields in a variable for you. You used to have to create the individual variables, and you still can if for some reason you want to. You can create separate variables to store individual fields from those records. And if you're going that route, then yes, the more thinking you do on paper, the easier it is to maintain, because filling out a bunch of these, if you make a mistake, it can be really hard to untangle.
Okay, next question. I've set up the unlock utility, and it is great for correcting mistakes once a record is approved. Is it possible to add Locking, unlocking to the field history on a record to remember that changes occurred after approval.
I am not certain about that. I would have to look up the documentation for these actions to see. I know that the unlock actions from unofficial SF are unmanaged, so you could theoretically um, add you could add directly to the apex perhaps, but you could also in your flow create like a chatter post. It's not quite the same thing. I'm not sure if you could get it into the field history. I haven't done a lot with that, but yeah, this is a relatively new flow for me that I was just like, hey, I wonder if I can do this. So I haven't explored it to its this is like the 101 version.
Okay, so last call for any questions for Sarah. And while we're waiting to see if anyone's going to sneak in with a question, I always like to find out from my presenters how they first started out with learning flow.
Oh,
So what was your experience like?
yeah, for me, it was, I'm pretty sure I first learned about it from Trailhead, um, as an option, or maybe at a Salesforce event that I went to, like one of my early world tours. But for me, flow was a little bit intuitive because I had some background in various programming languages that the idea of having variables and storing things in those variables and then using them later, which is sort of the core thing that flow does, was pretty like I already sort of had that concept coming into it.
Mm-hmm.
So it was more just learning the specifics of like, oh, how do you do that in this situation?
Mm-hmm.
And learning all the details of like what is a choice variable and like what are all the variables you have to make. But I definitely started by just taking real world problems that I had and said, I wonder if I can do this in Flow. And especially replicating process builders in Flow is really a great learning tool, I think, because they are the same thing ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a process builder that's working, you can use that as a template to say, how would I build that same process builder in a flow? And you can see the relationships there. So
And what would you say are your favorite features in Flow?
um, I I don't know. I love this is kind of silly, but I really love putting fun pictures in my flows.
I thought that was cute.
Yeah, like if I'm gonna put a message up there, I want it to be cute. I do love I didn't show it here, but it's a another unofficial SF component. I guess I love that Flow allows you to be so flexible in the way that you're designing things, that you have all of these different components that you can add, and one of them a data table, which I don't use in any of these flows, but this is a cool component that lets you display records from an object from a collection object in a little data table. So that's one of my favorite go-to components. But yeah, I love I love that I can just if I can dream it, I can probably build it. Um, it's so flexible. So that's cool.
And I see that Eric Smith is on, so thank you, Eric, for that data table.
Yes, thank you, Eric.
And so many of the other components that are on unofficial SF.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, so we are at time. That was a quick hour. Um, thanks so much, Sarah, for coming on and presenting. Definitely come back and present
Yeah.
again. We want you to come back multiple times. It can't just be your first time. Uh,
Yeah. First, but
so
definitely not the last.
open invitation.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed being here. I love flow, so I love sharing my love of it with everybody.
Great. And we will post the link to the recording as well as the deck out on our YouTube channel, Automation Hour, shortly after the presentation. So look for that. And thanks
Great.
so much, everyone. And we'll
Thank
talk to you next
you.
time. Bye.
Bye.